Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast listeners. My name is Juan Thomas, Chair of the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Section, and I'm so honored today to have as our guest Professor Nicole Iannarone, who is a professor of law at the Drexel Law School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Professor, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me, Juan. I'm excited to chat.
We're so honored that you're with us today. And today we're going to talk about everything financial securities. You are a professor of law and you teach civil procedure at Drexel, but you specialize in securities fraud and securities regulation. Could you kind of speak to us kind of just generally about what is securities fraud?
Yeah, it's a big topic. And what I focus on is regular people, regular Americans, and the types of disputes that they have with financial providers or in the securities industry. So that can range from anything from something we call affinity fraud, which is where someone is a member of a community or a group like a church or a fraternity or a social club, and someone comes to them and says, I have a great investment for you. And it turns out to be a fraud and stealing of their money, right? Or two different types of misstatements that are made in the securities markets that cause harm to investors in particular stocks. I focus more of my time in the financial advice area. You know, all of us, I'm saving for retirement. If something happened to my retirement account, it would be a problem for me and for my family. And I think it's really important for all of us to think about how do we protect ourselves and how should the law protect regular people who have to get ready to deal with retirement on their own because pensions just don't exist in the way that they used to.
I'm so glad you are with us today because your area of expertise ties into our theme for our bar year in our section, which is economic justice. And I've put forth the notion that part of economic justice is financial literacy, and that people have to be financially astute with respect to their resources and knowing how money works, but also how not to lose money or be deceived in how they invest or grow their wealth. And so I think your subject matter expertise is critically important for our listeners to know and for lawyers to know, particularly those lawyers who advise businesses, financial institutions, churches, nonprofits, as you mentioned. So could you kind of speak to what role lawyers should be playing, particularly lawyers who advise entities and individuals for that matter?
Yeah, so first off, I'd say we all need to get our own houses in order first, right? It's like eating your broccoli and brushing your teeth. Financial literacy is what my law students tell me is I went to law school because I was told there was no math. This is simple math. But if we're giving money to somebody and we're thinking about the future, we need it to be there. So that means we got to take care of ourselves first. What is our plan? Do we have one? And have we done the homework on it? Do we know what we're getting in exchange? Do we know how our provider is regulated? Are we checking every month to see what's there? And those are pretty basic things to do. Most of us don't do it, but we need to. And then after that, I talk to clients about what their needs are. There've been a lot of TV shows about family businesses that are changing hands, right? Succession has just ended. How are lawyers, when they're working with their business clients, talking to them about what's the plan for your business when you're not in charge anymore? If this is a family business, how are you all working through it together? And do you have any advice? What type of advice? Is it the right advice for you? And I think the final area that I'd look at, and I think lawyers are particularly well attuned to see, this is both in the business side, but perhaps even more so in personal individual representation. If a lawyer has a long-standing relationship with a client, they start to see when they might have some indication of cognitive decline. The sad reality is that every day I get older And every day I'm more likely to lose some of my mental facilities, right? We will all
Right.
have some form of decline. Lawyers are in a good place to see it. And frankly, where we first begin to see mental decline, first evidence of it, is an inability to manage bills and payments and finances. And so as lawyers, if we see that with our clients, it's important to have conversations with them about it and ensure that they're protected.
So it sounds like it's important for a lawyer to stay aware and be on top of not only the needs of their clients from a legal perspective, but also what's going on in their life, maybe from a mental health perspective, or just staying kind of in tune to what is important to that client. You are not but you are not saying that lawyers should become experts in financial securities or tax law or investments of that nature, right? I want to make sure we draw
No, I'm
that.
not.
Right.
No, I mean, that's, I talk to my husband about this all the time, and he would be the most challenging client on the planet simply because he says, I'm not going to read anything. You tell me, I hired you because you're the expert. You're going to ask me questions. I don't care. What should I do? Right. And that's a great point that you raised, Juan, because what we want to focus on as lawyers is giving our expertise. And
Right.
part of that is phoning a friend when it's not our area. I'm not a tax lawyer, but I've seen enough tax things happen that I know when to tell my client, you should call a tax lawyer. And I've got
Right.
somebody in mind. Same for financial law and other securities. You might need to talk to a planner about your business, not my area. And the other point that you bring up that I think is a super important one, I say all the time, we need to be educated investors. That's
Mm.
absolutely true. But I don't think that's a defense for somebody to say on the other side, when something goes wrong, you had the materials, you should have read them. That is not
Mm.
an excuse for fraud. And as much as we need to increase financial education and to protect ourselves, sometimes things will still go wrong, and the law can do better at
Right.
solving some of those issues.
So, Professor, what are the most common type of fraudulent activities that you've seen um, in your years in this space that not only should lawyers be aware of to advise their clients to avoid, but also for the lay person who's maybe not a lawyer, what should they be looking out for?
So I think all of us should be looking out for basically get rich quick. If somebody guarantees you 100% return on your investment in a month, it is
Right.
more likely than not a fraud. Um, Look to make sure that whoever you're working with is regulated and is registered with the appropriate regulator. They have, if they're a stockbroker, there's something called broker check where you can go and look up and see, are there any complaints, any disciplinary actions? Are they actually licensed to do the thing that they're doing?
Right.
And then, a deeper question to ask is, what standard do they practice under? We assume, and I always assume that if I'm working with a financial advisor, that they have to be a fiduciary. Not all of them are. So asking that question, are you giving advice under a fiduciary standard, is, I think, a really important one in part of that relationship. We as lawyers know how important communication is. We need to apply it to financial conversations too.
Do you find these attempts to fraud different persons more or less in different communities that are more vulnerable,
Yeah.
more susceptible to these type of practices, whether it be people of color or people with disabilities or maybe even the elderly?
Yes. So anybody with money can be a victim,
Right.
but we do see particular types of frauds in places where there's a lot of trust. Within my own family, one of my family members lost a great deal of money because they trusted an advisor at the church. Church is
Uh,
a big part of many communities. And unfortunately, you think that I can trust anybody who is in my church. A remarkable amount of investment frauds, Ponzi schemes, things of the type, come out of religious groups where someone takes
mm,
advantage of a trusting community. The same is true in different closely knit groups. Professional athletes have been victimized a great deal too. Many times, victims are those who have come into more money and said, "Oh my gosh, I have to get advice because I have a lot of it now." But it's not exclusive. You're absolutely right that it impacts all communities. And when I talk about affinity fraud, I mean there's some type of a relationship through church, through a racial or ethnic background, gender background, fraternity, sorority, social club. All of those can put someone at risk.
So what role can lawyers play, particularly lawyers who want to learn more about how to protect their clients, or who want to, stand up and advocate, or make sure there's less fraud? How can lawyers get involved in this space, and what ways would you recommend that lawyers get involved in these
So
issues?
a great question. Lots of ways to get involved. The first is to understand, get your own house in order, right? We've talked about that. The second, I think, is what happens if something goes wrong? You're working with a stockbroker, you or your client have a dispute. That goes to mandatory arbitration, which most people don't know. It's a very small, well, it's large in the investment community, but it is a small provider called Finra. It's a financial industry regulatory authority. They oversee the mandatory securities arbitration forum. And I raised this in response to your question of how we can get involved, because arbitrators are a combination of a judge and a jury in this space. I'm an arbitrator right now. I've never been selected. I am stricken all the time, for I don't know, good or bad reasons. But I got really interested in this topic when I was teaching in Georgia securities arbitration to a very diverse class. And we all looked around and at each other when we were talking about who was on the arbitration roster, and none of us were represented. At that time, the roster was almost it was extremely homogeneous, mostly white, and the vast majority of arbitrators were over the age of 70. Now, if someone who grew up on the South Texas border with Mexico, had a dispute with an investment advisor, I would be lucky to see a woman on the roster, but I certainly wouldn't see someone my age or my background. And I think it's important for representation to be there. So there've been a lot of efforts to diversify FINRA's arbitration roster, and they've done a great job with it. More can be done. So this is a very long-winded response to your simple question of what we can do, and that is we can try and be arbitrators. I mentioned that I'm an arbitrator. You fill out an application, you go through some training, and you take a test, and you have the opportunity for pay to help out the public and industry members who have disputes. I think it's also a great way to think about how we diversify the arbitration field writ large, right? Because when I think about who's an arbitrator, it's all my law partners who have retired. I'm not there yet. We need to build up expertise, and there is certainly underrepresentation in all arbitration. To get in there, you have to have experience. Let's find a way to get experience, and I think FINRA arbitration is a good way to do it.
And what's that website again?
Oh, yeah. So I will send you a link and we can put it up, but it's called FINRA. FINRA is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. They have an arbitrator and mediator webpage, and you can apply straight from their website. Online training. The pay is not the same probably as your hourly rate, but it's great experience. And when a foot in the door and experience is the key to becoming an arbitrator in other cases, I think it's a no-brainer to do. You just need to have 2 years of business experience, which all of us lawyers have, and a college degree. So yeah, I think we should all do it.
That is so important, and it's such a valuable resource, and something that young lawyers and other lawyers who may be looking to diversify their practice area should think about. It's often a practice area that's not really discussed. I know when I was in law school, that was not really something that was talked about as a path or a career path. So I think you've given our listening audience something to really think about with respect to another way to help their clients, but also advance justice in our profession. So I really want to thank you for offering that. And then for those lawyers who want to become more educated,
Mhm.
what type of resources would you recommend? Are there books? Are there other websites with resources on how to learn about the securities industry,
Mhm.
so they can kind of, bone up, if you will, to
Yeah,
use a legal term, uh, on how to approach this subject on their way to becoming an arbitrator?
sure. So even just for your personal life, you don't have to know anything about the industry to be an arbitrator. In fact, sometimes
Okay.
it's helpful not to. But I tend to look for nonprofits and government sites for information about investing. As we know, it's important to trust the source, right? We've all seen the news about the Chat GPT written briefs.
Oh
And
yeah.
we want to know where's the information coming from that's informing our decision making. So investor.gov, which is run by the SEC, has some great educational resources. Finra has an investor education foundation that also has some really wonderful resources. They're online, on the web. I'm happy to think about some more too, particularly to put up as links that might be
Yeah.
helpful for others. But yeah, anything with a .gov or a nonprofit, I think can be really, really helpful.
Well, that's great. So as we begin to wrap up, Nicole, let me ask you some questions about yourself. Um, if you were not a lawyer, what would you be and why?
It's such a tough question. I love being a lawyer. It's a big part of my identity, but I think I might be a ceramicist if I were not a lawyer. I have in the past 5 or 6 years picked up ceramics as a hobby, and if
Uh,
money were no object and I had every choice in the world, playing with
uh,
clay full time would be fantastic.
well, that is the first time I've heard someone say that. So you are unique in that regard, for sure.
Well,
For
I
sure.
encourage an artistic
Are you
practice
part
to
of a
all.
ceramic society?
No, no societies. I do it for fun, and
Okay.
it's not very good. But what I'll tell you is,
Uh,
our clients, and for me, my students, they come to us and they don't understand the law and what we do, and they seek our expertise. And it's really overwhelming to have a problem and not know how to fix it. And it's hard for us as lawyers who know the law so well to remember what it's like to not know how to do something. So I encourage my students and everyone to try something out that they've never done that's going to challenge them in a way that they're a novice so they can get back to that struggle. I think it
yeah,
helps us better connect with our clients.
that's great advice. Great advice. What's the last book you read? Or what book are you reading?
Well, right now I am reading a book that is, I really like security stuff. So I am reading the history of securities law decisions in the Supreme Court at the moment. It's a new publication. It's really interesting. It's not, it tells the story of the people involved in creating the securities laws and how that influenced the Supreme Court decisions that we think about and rely on today.
Well, you have been a tremendous guest today. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your contribution to our profession. Your line of work is so critically important. It's particularly around helping people protect their resources and their wealth. One of my mentors once told me, if you can help someone with their wealth, their health, or their children, you have a friend for life. And so I'm sure you are doing that, and many people respect and admire your work. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Juan. I've really appreciated chatting.
Yes. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you next week on our weekly chair chat. Take care.